You know, we hear it all the time. The world is shrinking, we're all becoming one big global village. But is that really true? Today, we're going to dig into a pretty provocative idea. What if this whole concept of a shared global culture is really just a Western myth? What if the world is actually becoming more distinct, not more similar? I mean, it's easy to see why you'd think we're all converging, right? You've got Hollywood movies playing in Beijing, K-pop blasting in Kansas. We're all watching the same shows and sharing the same memes. It definitely feels like we're more connected and, well, more alike than ever before. But here's the real question, the one that gets to the heart of all this. Does sharing a product, like a can of Coke, really mean you share a value system? Is all this global pop culture just a thin, shiny layer on top of much deeper, much more powerful cultural identities? All right, to really get a handle on this, we first have to break down what people even mean when they talk about a universal civilization. It's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, but it turns out it can mean a bunch of different and sometimes contradictory things. Okay, so according to our source material, this whole idea of a universal civilization basically stands on four pillars. Now, the first two, that humans have some basic moral sense and that civilized societies have things like cities and writing, yeah, that's generally true, but it's been true for centuries, so it doesn't really tell us anything new about our world today. So let's focus on the last two, because that's where things get really interesting. First, you've got this idea of a Davos culture. You know, the global elite, the top bankers, politicians, and academics who meet in Switzerland every year. They all speak English, they believe in free markets, they kind of share a worldview. But look at this number. This group, as powerful as it is, makes up less than 1% of humanity. Influential, for sure. Universal? Not even close. So what about that fourth pillar? The pop culture, the consumer goods, the Big Macs. Well, this quote from the source just nails the distinction. It argues that we completely trivialize Western culture when we act like its deepest principles, like the rule of law, symbolized by the Magna Carta, are the same thing as a fast food hamburger. And this example from the source really drives the point home, and it's a pretty stark one. Just because someone adopts the surface-level stuff from a culture, it doesn't mean they've adopted its core values. In fact, those very products can be used by people who are deeply hostile to that culture. The wrapper is not the same as what's inside. Okay, so if Cokes and blue jeans don't unite us, what about language? We're always told that English is taking over, right? That it's creating this one common platform for all of humanity. But is that what the data actually shows? All right, get ready for this, because this is where the story we all think we know gets turned completely upside down. Look at this data. Between 1958 and 1992, the proportion of people in the world who speak English as their native language actually went down. And it wasn't just English. The total share for all major Western languages dropped, while languages like Spanish and Hindi were on the rise. But wait a minute, you're probably thinking, English is everywhere, business, science, the internet. And you're right, but here's the key. It's functioning as a lingua franca. Think of it like a tool, like using the metric system. It's just a practical way for people who speak different languages to communicate. Using a tool doesn't change who you are. In fact, the source argues it actually reinforces your identity because it lets you interact with the world while preserving your own culture. Let's switch gears and talk about another huge piece of civilization, religion. If we were all truly becoming one global culture, you'd expect our beliefs would start to merge, or maybe everyone would just become less religious. So, what's actually happening? Converging? Not even close. The world's religious landscape is actually shifting dramatically. Because of demographic trends, the share of Christians in the world is projected to shrink a bit, while the proportion of Muslims is set to grow a lot. So much so that Islam is on track to become the world's largest religion. The world isn't getting less religious, it's getting more devout, but in very different ways. Okay, so let's recap. The evidence from pop culture, language, and religion, none of it really supports this idea of a universal civilization. And according to our source, the reason is a fundamental misunderstanding. For years, we've been confusing two things that are totally different, being modern and being Western. And this slide right here, this is the absolute heart of the whole argument. On the left, you've got modernization. That's a process. It's about industrialization, cities, mass media, stuff any society can go through. But on the right, you have westernization. That's about adopting a very specific culture with unique roots in things like the classical legacy, Christianity, and the separation of church and state. The West was the West long before it was modern. These are not the same thing. So, if becoming modern isn't the same thing as becoming Western, how have non-Western societies actually responded to the immense power and influence of the West over the past couple of centuries? Well, the source lays out three main paths that societies have taken. You can try to reject everything, you can try to become a complete carbon copy of the West, or you can try to forge a third way. So first up is rejectionism. Think of Japan before 1868, when it tried to just completely seal itself off from the rest of the world. In today's interconnected age, though, that strategy of total isolation is pretty much impossible. The cost is just way too high. The second path is called Kemalism, named after Mustafa Kemal Ataturk of Turkey. This is the idea that in order to modernize, you must westernize. You have to totally abandon your old culture to bring in the new one. And as you can imagine, this is a traumatic, difficult path that, our source argues, often creates a torn country that's stuck between two identities. And that brings us to the third and, by far, the most common response, reformism. The idea here is to selectively borrow. You adopt Western technology, science, and markets, all the tools of modernity, but you adapt them to serve and strengthen your own native culture. It's about being modern and Chinese, or modern and Japanese, not trying to become a substitute for them. So when you put all of this together, the failure of a single universal culture to emerge, and the fact that most societies are choosing this reformist path, it leads to this fascinating, deeply counterintuitive conclusion. This is what our source calls the Great Reversal. And here it is, the central paradox. In the early stages, Westernization might help kickstart modernization. But as a society becomes more modern, more educated, more wealthy, more powerful, it doesn't become more Western, it actually gains the confidence and the means to reassert its own unique cultural identity. Modernization actually fuels de-Westernization. This single sentence just captures the entire argument perfectly. The spread of technology and industry is happening everywhere for sure, but it isn't creating one homogeneous world. Instead, it's empowering multiple, distinct, and modern civilizations to emerge and flourish on their own terms. And that leaves us with a final, big question to chew on. If being modern gives different cultures the power to be more themselves, does that mean that as our technology connects us more than ever, our values, our beliefs, and our core identities might actually drift even further apart?